This is the explanation for the principle on the HIV 1 and 2 test procedure we performed in lab. So if you remember, we took 5 microliters of patient sample, and to that we had to add the 3 drops of running buffer to push the sample through the test system. So the sample traveled from the bottom toward the top. As the sample starts to travel across this immunoassay area, it comes into contact with something called antibody binding protein, which means it's a protein that will bind to or attach to any HIV antibodies and any other antibody that the person has in their blood sample. These ABPs, or antibody binding proteins, also have colloidal gold particles attached to them. These particles are what will cause the colored line if we see one in the test. So in this example, I have decided to assume that my patient has HIV-1 antibodies in their blood. So these antibodies are traveling through the system. Antibody binding proteins attach to those antibodies when they find and come into contact with them, and the sample continues to travel into the test area. In the test area, we have HIV-2 antigens and HIV-1 antigens. Since our patient has antibodies to HIV-1, they bind to the HIV-1 antigens in the test area, and enough of those gold particles get together that we see a line in that area. As with every one of these immunoassays, there are extra antibody binding proteins with the gold particles attached to them, and so those will continue to travel because they have not bound to an antibody. Once those antibody binding proteins reach the control area, there are antibodies immobilized in the control area that want to specifically bind to the antibody binding protein. When those antibodies grab up and bind to the protein, they also stop the gold particles in the control area, and that's why we see a line in the control area. That is also the reason that we have to say the test is invalid if we don't see a control line, because this is proving to us that the sample traveled all the way through the testing system and all the way past that control area. This is the same idea behind the flu test that we also performed today and behind an HCG test, but the difference in the HIV test is that we have antigen immobilized in the test area rather than antibody, as we had with the other 2 tests.